When James and Marissa Levin signed the papers for the old brick townhouse in New York's Upper East Side, they couldn't believe their luck. The listing had been on the market for nearly 2 years, the price dropping slowly but steadily, until it finally fell into their range. It wasn't until their real estate agent casually mentioned that it had once belonged to Anthony Bourdain that they realized why no one had touched it. The property was beautiful, 3 stories tall, with polished wood floors, a narrow but functional kitchen, and tall windows that let in pale, golden light. Still, there was something about it that felt weighty, as though the air itself was thicker inside. First, they brushed it off. Bourdain had been a larger-than-life figure, his books, his shows, his travels. Maybe the heaviness they felt was just the lingering aura of someone who had lived so fully. But little things began to chip away at that rational explanation. On their first night, Marissa awoke to the faint smell of cigarette smoke drifting through the hallway, though neither she nor James smoked. It was mixed with another scent: garlic, lemon, seared fish, like someone was cooking in the kitchen. When she got up to check, the kitchen was empty, the counters clean, and the stove cold to the touch. James, who worked from home, started hearing soft clinks and the faint scrape of a knife on a cutting board during the day. Sometimes, when he walked into the kitchen, a cabinet door would be ajar, or a spoon would be sitting out, though he swore he hadn't touched it. By the 3rd week, the sounds grew clearer. They weren't just kitchen noises anymore. There were footsteps on the stairs at night, deliberate and slow, as though someone was coming up from the ground floor. Marissa began dreaming about places she'd never been. Dim, crowded markets in faraway countries, narrow streets lit by neon, tables set in the middle of bustling plazas. In the dreams, she was always following a man whose face she couldn't quite see, though his voice was warm, deep, and unmistakably Anthony Bourdain's. Then came the night James saw him. He had woken around 2 a.m. to get water. As he passed the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of a tall, lean figure leaning over the counter, hands moving as if chopping vegetables. The man never looked up, but James noticed the gray hair, the rolled-up sleeves, the tattoos on his forearm. Before James could speak, the figure seemed to fade like steam dissipating into nothing. From that night on, they understood. They weren't alone in the house. And whatever kept Anthony Bourdain's spirit there wasn't ready to let them live in peace. The days after James's encounter were marked by a strange, unspoken agreement between him and Marissa. Neither of them wanted to bring up what was happening, as though speaking it aloud might give it more power. But the house didn't care for their silence. It kept offering its quiet reminders that it wasn't theirs alone. Morning light in the townhouse had always been muted, filtered through the old wavy glass in the tall windows. But now, James noticed something unsettling in that early light. Dust didn't float lazily in the air anymore. It seemed to move with purpose, drifting toward the kitchen as though carried by an invisible current. On more than one occasion, he stood at the bottom of the staircase, holding his coffee, and swore he heard the faint pop and sizzle of oil in a hot pan. Marissa's nights had grown restless. She would drift into sleep only to be pulled into vivid dreams, not the fleeting, fragmented images of ordinary sleep, but scenes so detailed they felt like lived experiences. She could smell the tang of soy sauce in a humid Hong Kong alley, hear the guttural hum of scooters in Hanoi, feel the metal edge of a fork as she sat at a table in a Parisian cafe. Always somewhere just ahead of her was that man, his shoulders slightly hunched as he leaned over a plate or spoke to someone she couldn't see. She never caught his face, but she could feel his presence, warm yet unbearably distant. The dreams stayed with her in the mornings. She'd wake up with a craving for dishes she had never eaten, sometimes writing down ingredients she didn't even know how to pronounce. The fridge slowly filled with jars of preserved lemons, imported fish sauce, spices in small cloth sacks from a specialty store she'd never visited before. James, at first amused, began to worry when she admitted she didn't remember buying them. One late afternoon, James was working in the small office on the 2nd floor when he heard a low, rhythmic thumping downstairs. It wasn't the dull sound of a pipe or the groan of old wood. It was deliberate, almost like the butt of a knife hitting a cutting board. He set his laptop aside and listened. The sound stopped. He waited. Then it came again, this time accompanied by the metallic clink of a pan being set down. He crept down the stairs, trying to keep his footsteps quiet. The kitchen was dim, the only light coming from the fading sun through the narrow back window. For a moment, he thought the room was empty until he saw movement in the reflection of the oven door. A figure stood at the counter, back turned to him. The same tall frame, the same slightly bowed head. The man's hands moved quickly, expertly, as though preparing something only he could see. James stared, his heart thudding painfully, until the figure straightened, paused, and began to turn. And then nothing. The space was empty, the air heavy with a sudden, almost choking smell of seared meat and fresh herbs. James stepped forward, his hands trembling, and reached for the counter. It was warm. That night, Marissa found him sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the empty counter, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. When she asked what was wrong, he only said, "I think he knows we're here now." From then on, the house seemed to breathe differently. Doors that had always stayed open were found closed. The faint hiss of a gas stove would sometimes wake them in the middle of the night, only for them to find the burners cold. A low hum almost like a man's voice would drift down the hallways, impossible to make out but strangely comforting, until they realized they couldn't tell if it was speaking to them or to someone else. It was in the second month that the haunting became personal. Up until then, everything could be brushed away with enough stubbornness. Old pipes, neighborhood smells drifting in through vents, tricks of the light. But now, the house wasn't just making noise or replaying moments from another life. It was acknowledging them. It began with the notes. One morning, Marissa came downstairs to make coffee and found a small scrap of paper on the kitchen counter. It was torn from a notebook she didn't own. The edges uneven, the paper slightly yellowed. Written in slanted, hurried handwriting were just 2 words. "Try fennel." She showed it to James, who frowned and suggested maybe it was left behind from the move, something a contractor had jotted down and forgotten. But the next morning, another scrap appeared, this one tucked into the handle of the refrigerator. "Less salt." Marissa laughed it off at first. She was the one who cooked most nights, and she'd been experimenting with the new spices in the pantry. But on the 3rd day, the note read, "Overcooked." The handwriting never changed. That same week, James began finding things moved not in big, dramatic ways, but in ways that felt intimate. His favorite coffee mug, always kept in the cabinet above the sink, would be sitting on the counter when he woke. His worn leather notebook, which he always left on his desk upstairs, would sometimes be found in the dining room, open to a blank page. One evening, after Marissa had gone to bed, James stayed downstairs answering emails. The house was quiet except for the low tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of traffic outside. At some point, he realized the smell of food was creeping in again, not faint this time, but strong, vivid. He could identify every layer. Garlic sizzling in oil, fresh basil torn by hand, the sweet acidity of tomatoes just beginning to break down in a pan. It was too real. It was the kind of smell that clung to your clothes, seeped into your skin. When he stepped into the kitchen, the air felt warmer, almost humid, as if someone had been cooking for hours. The counter was bare, but the cutting board one they hadn't used in days was dusted with what looked like fine crumbs. He reached out, running his fingers through them, only to realize they were still slightly warm. He didn't tell Marissa, not that night, but the house wasn't content with subtlety anymore. 2 nights later, Marissa woke in the dark, her throat dry. She rolled over to nudge James awake, but the space beside her was empty. Pushing herself up, she noticed a faint glow spilling out from the staircase. Barefoot, she padded down the steps, the cool wood creaking beneath her. The glow grew stronger as she neared the kitchen, until she rounded the corner and froze. Every light in the kitchen was on, the overhead, the under-cabinet strips, even the small bulb inside the oven. The counters were cluttered with ingredients she didn't remember owning. Fresh fish wrapped in butcher's paper, bunches of herbs still damp from rinsing, small ceramic bowls filled with spices. And standing at the stove, sleeves rolled to his elbows, was a tall man with salt and pepper hair. His movements were calm, practiced, as he stirred something in a pan. She couldn't see his face, but she knew. She knew. Her breath caught, and in that instant he stopped. Slowly, he set down the spoon, turned halfway toward her, and though his features were still obscured by shadow, she saw the glint of his eyes sharp, alive, focused directly on her. The lights went out. She was left alone in the dark, the only thing remaining a faint curl of steam rising from the empty stove. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. After that night, the townhouse seemed to rearrange itself around them. It wasn't that the rooms physically changed, no walls shifting, no furniture moving on its own, but rather that the feeling of each space no longer belonged entirely to them. The kitchen no longer felt like their kitchen. The narrow hallway to the second floor no longer felt like the hallway they'd walked 100 times. It was as though they were tenants in someone else's home, quietly tolerated, but never quite welcome. Marissa started noticing subtle changes in her own behavior. She found herself cooking meals she'd never learned, her hands moving with a confidence she didn't recognize, searing meat perfectly, chopping vegetables with precise, rhythmic cuts. She told herself it was just the hours she'd been spending in the kitchen lately, but there were moments mid-preparation when she would stop, knife in hand, and feel him standing just behind her, unseen but present, as if guiding her wrists with invisible fingers. The strangest part was the growing sense of invitation. In the evenings, after the day's faint noises and smells had come and gone, the house would settle into a peculiar stillness. That was when it would happen. The low hum, almost like a voice, barely audible over the quiet. It didn't come from any one direction, it was around them, a vibration in the air, words not quite forming but carrying an unmistakable tone. Warm, reassuring, urging. James began having dreams too, not of cooking like Marissa's but of traveling. In them, he walked alone through narrow, dim streets that smelled of sea air and smoke. He could hear distant conversations in languages he didn't understand, see flashes of neon signs reflecting off wet pavement. And always there was the sound of footsteps just ahead, steady and deliberate, leading him onward. When he woke, his heart would ache with a longing he couldn't explain, as though he'd left something unfinished in a place he'd never been. One late afternoon, while sorting through a box of books in the living room, James found a small leather-bound notebook wedged between the shelves. It was old, the leather cracked, the pages faintly yellowed. Inside were scrawled lists, places, dishes, market names, some crossed out, others underlined. At the bottom of one page, in the same slanted handwriting as the notes they'd found earlier, was a single phrase. "You should see it for yourself." He didn't tell Marissa about the notebook, but that night he dreamed of a fish market by the water. The air was damp, salty, and the shouts of vendors echoed in his ears. He could see the glisten of fresh catches laid over ice, smell the sharp brine of the sea, and just beyond the stalls, a tall figure in a faded jacket turned and began to walk away from him. James followed, weaving through the crowd, his pace quickening until the man stopped, glanced over his shoulder, and met his eyes. When James woke, his mouth still tasted faintly of salt. The days grew harder to separate from the nights. Marissa once swore she saw a street outside their living room window where the familiar row of brownstones should have been a busy street, lined with unfamiliar signs and the blur of movement, gone when she blinked. One evening, she returned from the store to find James in the kitchen, cooking something that filled the entire house with a rich, layered aroma. He didn't notice her at first. His sleeves were rolled, his movements fluid, confident. She stood in the doorway, watching as he plated the food with meticulous care, sprinkling herbs with a practiced flick, wiping the edge of the plate clean with a cloth. When he finally looked up, there was a moment, just a breath, when she didn't see her husband at all. And then he smiled, almost sheepishly, and said, "It's ready. Thought we'd try something different tonight." The meal was exquisite. Neither of them spoke much while eating, but both felt the same thing. Somewhere in the spaces between their words, between their bites, the presence in the house was growing stronger. It wasn't just with them anymore. It was in them. The shift was so gradual that neither of them could point to the exact moment it began. Days bled into nights, and the townhouse seemed to exist in a kind of suspended reality, where time obeyed rules that had nothing to do with clocks. The outside world still existed. They went to work, ran errands, paid bills, but whenever they crossed back over the threshold, they stepped into something older, heavier, and wholly apart. Marissa noticed it first in her own reflection. One morning, while tying her hair back in the bathroom mirror, she caught a fleeting movement, her own hand lifting a cigarette to her mouth. She didn't smoke. There was no cigarette there, just the phantom gesture. But it was so familiar, so casual, that for an instant she could almost taste the bitter tang of tobacco. It left her staring at herself, unsettled, her fingers curling unconsciously, as if holding something that wasn't there. James's changes were quieter but no less strange. He began to keep odd hours, slipping out of bed at 2 or 3 in the morning and padding downstairs without explanation. Sometimes Marissa would wake and hear the faint scrape of a chair being pulled back in the kitchen, the soft clink of a fork against a plate. When she asked him about it, he'd just shrug, looking puzzled, as though he couldn't remember leaving the bedroom at all. The dreams were no longer dreams. They came in fragments, disjointed but vivid enough to leave impressions on their waking minds. James found himself standing on the deck of a small fishing boat at dawn, the horizon painted in streaks of orange and gray. He could smell diesel and salt, hear gulls overhead, feel the rough weave of the net beneath his hands. Then, without warning, he would be somewhere else, a dimly lit bar in an unfamiliar city, the air heavy with the scent of whiskey and fried food, someone's laughter spilling out from a shadowed corner. For Marissa, it was the kitchens. Not their kitchen, but others' cramped, humid rooms with low ceilings, the hiss and pop of oil, the clang of metal spoons in deep pans. Her hands moved without thought, her body weaving effortlessly through narrow spaces between other cooks. She could feel the heat of the stove on her face, the burn in her shoulders from hours of chopping, the rhythm of work that was both exhausting and exhilarating. And always somewhere just out of reach was him. Sometimes only a voice, warm but tinged with irony, offering a wry comment or a quiet instruction. Other times a figure at the edge of her vision, leaning against a counter, watching her with that same unblinking focus she had felt in the kitchen that night. One evening, as the last of the daylight faded to a bruised purple, they sat together at the dining table, a bottle of red wine between them. Neither of them had poured it, but it was there, already open, the cork resting neatly beside it. James poured them each a glass without speaking. The conversation that followed wasn't really theirs. Words flowed easily, stories about places they'd never visited, meals they'd never eaten, people they'd never met. The details came with such precision: the weather that night in Marseille, the exact flavor of a bowl of pho in Hanoi, that it was impossible to believe they were inventing them. At some point, Marissa reached for her glass and noticed her hand trembling. Not with fear, but with something closer to anticipation. She didn't want the night to end, didn't want the pull of this strange, intoxicating presence to loosen. James, across from her, was smiling faintly in a way she'd never seen before. Later, when they cleared the table, Marissa found another scrap of paper tucked under her plate. "You're getting better." The handwriting was the same. The breaking point came on a Sunday night. The day had been ordinary in every visible way: laundry tumbling in the dryer, rain tapping against the windows, the muted glow of the TV flickering in the living room. But beneath that surface, both James and Marissa felt it. A low, persistent current running through the house, as though it were holding its breath. By dusk, the rain had stopped. The air in the townhouse was unnaturally still. James had been upstairs reading, Marissa in the kitchen slicing bread. Without warning, the lights in the house dimmed, not flickered, not surged, but dimmed evenly, as though someone had turned down a dial. The shadows lengthened, pooling in the corners, and the air filled with that now familiar smell. Garlic, citrus, fresh herbs, sizzling meat. It was stronger than ever before, so dense and layered it seemed to settle over them like a physical weight. "James," Marissa called, but her voice sounded smaller than she intended. Footsteps approached not from the stairs, but from the hallway leading to the kitchen. They were slow, deliberate, and heavier than James's. She set the knife down carefully and turned. The figure was there, framed in the doorway. Salt and pepper hair, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a lean frame that moved with unhurried confidence. His face was in shadow, but the posture, the presence, it was Anthony Bourdain. For a moment, the room held its breath. Then he stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to peel away just enough for her to see his expression. His eyes were sharp, but not cold curious, almost amused, as if he'd been waiting for this meeting all along. James appeared behind him in the hallway, his face pale. But he didn't look at Marissa, his gaze was locked on the man in front of them. No one spoke. Bourdain moved past Marissa without acknowledgement, heading straight for the stove. His hands began working automatically, pulling pans from hooks, setting them on the burners, reaching for ingredients that hadn't been there moments ago. The gas clicked, flames flared, and the kitchen came alive with sound and heat. Marissa found herself stepping forward, almost without choice, taking a position at the counter. A cutting board appeared before her, a knife resting on it. She began chopping herbs precisely, efficiently, though she didn't remember deciding to do it. James moved to the other side of the stove, reaching for a skillet. His movements, too, were fluid, assured, like a man following muscle memory that wasn't his own. The air shimmered faintly, as if the entire room were underwater. And then the voices began, not from Bourdain, but from everywhere. The low murmur of crowded markets, the clink of glasses in dim bars, the rush of traffic in foreign streets, the faint hiss of waves against a dock. Every sound folding into the next, all of it surrounding them. They weren't in the townhouse anymore. They were in kitchens they'd never seen, standing on streets they'd never walked, tasting food they'd never made. And then, just as suddenly, they were back. Bourdain was plating the food, the aromas so vivid they made Marissa's eyes sting. He set the plates before them, one in front of James, one in front of her, then stood back, watching. They ate in silence. Every bite was perfect, complex, layered, alive. By the time they'd finished, the plates were empty, the air cooling, the scents fading. When Marissa looked up, he was gone. James reached for her hand across the table. His palm was cold. They didn't speak of it that night or the night after, but they both knew something had changed. The sounds, the smells, the dreams, they didn't stop. But they no longer felt like intrusions. They felt permanent. Weeks later, when a friend came to visit, she remarked on how warm and alive the house felt, how the kitchen seemed to have its own personality. Marissa smiled faintly, glancing toward the stove. It did. And every so often, late at night, when the house was quiet, they would hear the sound of a knife tapping softly against a cutting board, steady and sure, as though someone was still teaching them how to get it just right. They never thought of moving again, because the house wasn't just haunted. It had taken them in, and they had let it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.